Welcome back. Welcome to the stage, Viet Thanh Ngyuyen and Dr. Khoi Lei.
Hello, well, welcome, and thank you so much for choosing our session. I'm looking around to see if I have any patients here. My name's Khoi Lei. I'm a cardiologist at Eisenhower, and I'm always nervous about having to work when I'm not working. Oh, yeah? You look pretty good. I hope you made a good choice at lunch. Yeah. Anyway, we're so pleased to have Viet Thanh Ngyuyen here with us today. He is someone whose schedule has gotten astronomically busy over the last 18 months with the prizes that he's garnered since the 2015 publication of his book, The Sympathizer, which won so many prizes that I struggle to remember them all, but I'm going to have a go at it. It's the Asian Pacific American Book Award, the California Book Award, the Carnegie Medal of Excellence, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edgar First Book Award from the Mystery Writers of America, and my favorite, Le Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger, which means the best foreign book by a French organization. And that's most of them, but it's not all of them, I know. But the big one was the Pulitzer. Thank you. I wasn't going to forget that one. And it's a very interactive audience. That's good. You know, usually after lunch, it's a little bit sleepy crowd. So this is, and so if you haven't read the book, it's the story of a spy, and it's told as a confession in the first person. And this spy is born to a Vietnamese teenage servant with her French master, who's a priest. And as he grows up, he goes into South Vietnam, but he's a North Vietnamese double agent, so he rises through the ranks of the South Vietnamese secret police, and he's trained by the CIA in interrogation techniques, which means torture. And then in 1975, when Saigon either falls or is liberated, depending on your point of view, he goes with the South Vietnamese people who flee to California, and his role there is to spy on the expat community in Saigon on their anti-communist activities, and the story just gathers momentum from there, and it's funny, it's riveting, it's suspenseful, it's sardonic, it's ironic, sarcastic, obscene.
A little bit obscene, not too
obscene.
much.
Absurd, but brilliant throughout. So after he finished this book, he actually published a book that I think that was written in some ways in the years leading up to The Sympathizer that informed the choice of the Sympathizer, and it's a nonfiction book about, that's called Nothing Ever Dies, the Vietnam War in Memory. And it's a highly academic book about the role of culture, of cinema, books, novels, memoirs, monuments, cemeteries, video games, photography, and how we remember war, and how that maybe influences our choices to go into future wars. And then, a year later, another book, which also made the New York Times notable 100 books, and it's a collection of short stories called The Refugees, which continues with themes of loneliness and a choice of which memories to recall and which ones to suppress, and isolation, all of this which is very central to the refugee experience. So after that book came out, then he got the MacArthur Genius Grant. So it's somewhat humbling to be sitting here in your presence, because you know, I thought I was doing a pretty good job as a Vietnamese, living every Vietnamese parent's dream of coming here and going to a good school and becoming a doctor. I thought that, you know, I've met all the requirements, but then he comes along and my parents are looking at me a little bit thoughtfully now, wistfully, saying there's no big prize there. What's going on? So,
You know, the irony of it is that it only takes a Pulitzer Prize to make Vietnamese parents happier than getting a cardiovascular surgeon or doctor as a son.
It's the equivalent of the Vietnamese F now.
Yeah,
What I did.
Well, we gotta keep raising the bar, breaking the curve.
But I think I was asked to do this because we share some things in common. We were both born in Vietnam. We both came here in 1975. You can't tell, but I'm much, much older. It's hard to tell. I'm 10 years older than Viet. I came when I was 14, and he came when I was 4. And so we both arrived here, and imagine the irony of coming here at the end of our revolutionary conflict, just as the U.S. is about to celebrate its 200th, the Bicentennial celebration, right, 1975. So it was an interesting time to be a newcomer to the country, especially with our background. But before we get started, you know, I think just to set the stage, I wonder if you could read the opening of the prologue from Nothing Ever Dies, which is the academic nonfiction book.
Yeah. I just have to say in my defense that academics think it's a really easy book to read. So it's all relative. Yeah.
Depends on your point of view.
I was born in Vietnam, but made in America. I count myself among those Vietnamese dismayed by America's deeds, but tempted to believe in its words. I also count myself among those Americans who often do not know what to make of Vietnam and want to know what to make of it. Americans, as well as many people the world over, tend to mistake Vietnam with the war named in its honor, or dishonor, as the case may be. This confusion has no doubt led to some of my own uncertainty about what it means to be a man with two countries, as well as the inheritor of two revolutions. Yeah, so that you know, it's definitely related to the bicentennial framing that you were talking about, which I really remember too. I was only 5 years old in 1976, but I remember those magazine covers and everything like that. And now thinking back on that history, I think, well, we as Americans only remember that as a glorious triumph and victory and all of that. But you know, in reality, only about a third of Americans were actually actively revolutionaries, and a third of them were neutral, and a third of them were Tories fighting on the other side. And all those people got kicked out of the country, and their memories have been erased. And
you don't hear their stories.
You don't hear their stories. And that is very similar to what has happened to the South Vietnamese and to Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese Americans. We fought on the wrong side in terms of history, and we're in danger of of having our memories erased, which is the case in Vietnam. So if you go to Vietnam, beautiful country, by the way, I highly recommend it. There is a lot of memory work happening, but it's only commemorating one side. And our side has literally been erased. Yeah. And you know, here that's true in the United States as well.
It's such a complicated question, though, because in the United States, it's the dialogue's been flipped last year. I mean, we're talking about monuments to the fallen South, and their leaders' monuments are taken away. I mean, it sounds a little familiar, maybe, with what was happening in South Carolina and Louisiana and Texas. I mean, do we preserve monuments to the losing side if they had what we consider to be a bad cause? Or?
Well, you know, one thing I say in the book, Nothing Ever Dies, is that all wars are fought twice. Right. First time on the battlefield, second time in memory. Yep. And that's been true for pretty much any war that I can think of. And you would imagine the Civil War has been done over 150 years, right? And we're still fighting it because we haven't actually settled the issues that led to that war in the first place. And in that question of memorials and monuments, I think, well, the debate over those memorials and monuments is, to a certain extent, about erasing that history. I mean, some people would say, you know, oh, slavery wasn't an issue, racism wasn't an issue. And of course they were. So yes, those monuments and memorials should be taken down, but that doesn't mean the past is erased. These are two separate things altogether. You know, we're still talking about that past. In Vietnam, the moment the Vietnamese communists won, they literally tore down the statues of the South, and they erased the South from the history books and public commemorations and everything like that. That hasn't happened in the United States.
I think it's so beautiful. Everybody's gone to Washington, D.C., and you've seen the Vietnam War Memorial and the names. And, you know, it's very emotional for me to still see it, just the power of names and memory. Of course, if you included the names of Vietnamese soldiers. You know, that someone said the wall would be 9 miles long or something like that, right? If you just had the same thing. In Vietnam, we have cemeteries for soldiers as well for the South. So it's not that they don't exist, but they're not really very well cared for, as we were talking about.
Well, so remembering always takes place with forgetting. So you go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's a beautiful memorial, right? And you're drawn to those 58,000 plus American names there on the wall. But in order for us to remember those names, we, collectively as Americans, have to forget the 3 million dead Vietnamese at the same time. They're not brought up, right? And of course, we also forget the 3 million dead Laotians and Cambodians, because most Americans, I think, would be astonished to know the war was even fought in Laos and in Cambodia as well. And those same processes are happening in Vietnam. They happen everywhere, so Americans are not unique about that. But one thing I want to say is the reason why I think it's still urgent to talk about the American processes of memory and forgetting is that they concern not just Americans, they concern everybody, right, because of American power. So for example, when people found out I was researching Nothing Ever Dies about the Vietnam War, no matter where I went in this world, people would say, have you seen Apocalypse Now? You know, and this includes, for example, Italian communists. Italian communists opposed to the Vietnam War, opposed to American imperialism, they love Apocalypse Now. You know, but if I were to ask people how many people have seen a Vietnamese movie, for example, how many people have seen a Vietnamese movie? That's absolutely right. So that's why it's still urgent to draw attention to the way that Americans remember and forget, because the American story becomes exported all over the world, and that's how the world remembers Vietnam.
Well, the power of language is a big thing, and I read a novel by a work by a Japanese woman who went to Yale, actually, and is right. But she writes in Japan in Japanese about how they're losing their language, and because books don't really matter unless they're in English, or nothing gets out unless it's translated in English globally, right? So these movies are not going to have a very big audience if they're not accessible.
Yeah, and that's one of the strange, situations of being a minority writer writing in English. It's a very ambivalent situation, right? Because there's all kinds of inequalities and so on within the United States, but writing in English gives me an opportunity that people in Vietnam don't have, because you can be a great writer writing in Vietnamese in Vietnam, but your stories are not going to get translated and sent all over the world. And writing in English, there's that opportunity, right? So that's one of the strange, legacies of being a minority or being colonized. You get to write in the language of the master.
But it's interesting because even the Sympathizer, so if I were to project what the influences, literary influences might have been for you, going to Sympathizer, say, okay, there's an interrogation scene, maybe that's the Dostoevsky, or Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, and you talked last night about the Portuguese writer Antonio Lobo Antunes, once he was translated and accessible. You talk about maybe there's a scene that's lifted from Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. Graham Greene, obviously, people will compare to because of The Quiet American. And maybe lots and lots and lots of American comic books went into this. But not so many Vietnamese authors.
Well, that was right, because, I grew up, so I came here when I was 4 years old, which meant I had 4-year-old Vietnamese. And I think I made a choice, which I wasn't even articulate about to myself, which was, well, I can be mediocre in 2 languages, Vietnamese and English, or I can be...
That was my choice.
That was my choice. Well, and I would
choice.
disagree. I would disagree. But I think it was for me clear that to belong to this country, to belong in this country, one has to speak English. And to really be American, one has to be fluent in English. And to contest American stories, one has to be masterful in English. And I felt I had to be masterful. I was getting ready for a fight. My parents owned the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California. And when I was a child, I walked nearby and I saw a sign in a shop window. And it said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." I understood that sign, although I didn't totally understand its meaning. And the meaning, as it became clear to me over the years, is that we don't belong here, or many people would feel that we, as Vietnamese people, are foreigners and we don't belong here, and worse, we're a threat to the good Americans of this country, which I completely disagree with. And I felt that, you chose one path to become a doctor, and I failed that path. And because I was pre-med for 11 weeks, I was like, okay, this is not for me. Okay. and so I became a writer because I want to fight against that story in that sign, which I think a lot of Americans really do believe in. And in countries all over the world, they all have their own versions of that sign, directed at the people they consider to be foreigners or others. And so my fight was going to be in language and in storytelling, and I had to become really, really good at English to make that happen.
We're talking about the immigrant experience. We're talking about the Vietnamese immigrant experience, but how many people here were either born outside the U.S. or had a parent or grandparent that came as an immigrant? So I don't know if our camera can pan around, but it's really a majority in this country. So is it different to be an immigrant or a refugee of color as opposed to being white?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I mean, obviously, if we look at the history of our country and we look at the history of European immigrants, for example, it's obvious they were treated badly, many of them, when they got here. The Irish were compared to African Americans, for example. The Sicilians and the Greeks were considered to be less than white in 1900. But over 100 years later, they're pretty much considered white in most circumstances, unless it's like the Sopranos or something like that. But it's otherwise pretty much white. And that's not been totally the case for immigrants of color, however we choose to define that. And so there is still a racial boundary to the immigrant experience. And that's why race still becomes a factor as we discuss immigration today. I can't help but hear a lot of racial undertones in these arguments about let's stop so-called chain migration, which is to say let's stop family reunification, because if we don't stop family reunification, that handful of Asians that we admit are just going to bring all their thousands of relatives with them. And unfortunately, fortunately, that is actually what happened. But nevertheless, I think that's a good thing that there's been family reunification. So it's so crucial for me to be advocating constantly for the possibilities of immigrants and refugees and how they come to this country as being people who bring new things, new energies, new stories to this country.
It's a question of when do you transfer your allegiance, and it's different ways of testing that. I think for my friends who are Italian Americans, it was when the U.S. played Italy in a World Cup soccer match. Who do you root for? And at what generation do you start rooting for the Stars and Stripes instead of the blue? It never happens with Vietnam, because Vietnam doesn't actually play against the United States in any sport that I can recall. So
I think we win at badminton. If there was ever a badminton competition, we're really good at that.
Yeah.
Yes. Ping pong, yes.
Ping pong? Table tennis, sir. Thank you. So, now, in 1975, when you came over, when you're an immigrant, what you hear is, welcome to America. It's the great melting pot, right? So all these different metals go into this big cauldron. It's heated up, and we have this American alloy, so strong, so unique. And it's a blend of all these different cultures. Now, I don't hear the term melting pot so much. I hear multiculturalism. And we kind of celebrate the different tribes and what makes each unique. So there are these two extremes. They're both good. Maybe you can say, well, if the country goes to war, it's better if you have the melting pot mentality that you belong to this large tribe. But maybe embracing these different cultural differences is of value too. Now, clearly, we are kind of leaning towards that other part, but it seems like it's had a big impact on our political discourse and our ability to get along with each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the metaphors change about who becomes an American and what American culture is. And of course, I stand on the side of multiculturalism and diversity. But I've also had the opportunity to travel to other countries like France and Britain, and each of these countries has their own systems for talking about cultural difference, or not talking about cultural difference in the case of the French, for example. You know, so the French argue that you have the possibilities of universal humanism. Anybody can become a French person, doesn't matter what your origins are, and yet racism still persists in France. How's that possible? And we have multiculturalism, and racism still persists here. How's that possible? So I don't think, I mean, these cultural models don't solve our problems. They give us different opportunities to tell our stories. And so multiculturalism has given an opportunity for Vietnamese and Asian American writers to become visible, for example. But unless we actually contend with our histories, like the history of the Civil War, you know, that have left deep structural inequalities in our societies and deep legacies of economic and racial inequity, all these, the melting pot or multiculturalism or universal humanism, those aren't going to solve the problems of inequality.
The dialogues change a lot about the way Americans view their country too, because I think in '75 when we're coming and you've got this big celebration going on, the Bicentennial, you know, the legends are the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the Founding Fathers. And now you say Pilgrims and Puritans and people say genocide. Or you say Founding Fathers, slave owners. You know, so it's really a bit different that way. Now when you came, we had different circumstances because I settled in South Bend, Indiana, and so there was not a other Asian person in sight. But you were in the second largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam, and your parents had a Vietnamese grocery store. So you must have been surrounded by Vietnamese people. How did you view yourself? What did that feel like?
Well, you know, gosh, I was lucky, I think, to have that kind of a background, even though it's also very tormenting at the same time, because you're surrounded by Vietnamese people. And what that meant was that I could never escape from Vietnamese stories. You know, I mean, I grew up watching the same TV and movie shows that you did and everything, TV shows and movies that you did, and you know, when it came to things like Vietnam or the Vietnam War, it was all about Americans. But growing up in a Vietnamese community and in a Vietnamese household, all I heard were stories about Vietnam and how the war affected us. And growing up in a community that was saturated with anger and bitterness and rage and melancholy and sadness and domestic violence and gang violence and all these kinds of things that were totally omnipresent for us and completely invisible to the rest of American society. And that really impressed upon me from a young age that there was a problem here, you know, that I know that all these people have such different kinds of urgent stories to be told, and people aren't telling these stories, and people aren't listening to these stories, and so there's a role for people like me who wanted to become writers and who wanted to become storytellers. We need doctors and engineers and lawyers, but we also need storytellers and writers as well. And that's something that when you are part of the majority, you can take for granted. You know, when you're part of the majority, part of the privilege of being a part of the majority is that there's thousands and thousands of stories told about you. So if somebody gets one, so Harvey Weinstein, okay, he doesn't represent America, all right? He's just an accident, you know? But when you don't have very many stories at all the stories and all the storytellers take on such urgency, that burden of representation that you were talking about. And that's what I was feeling when I was growing up.
We're not really represented in the stories either. You know, I think back in the 70s, you turn on the television, we were talking about who are the Asians that you see on the television screen. Everybody's taking a minute. Zulu, Hop Sing, I don't know. Arnold, right?
Someone you didn't mention from the last session was from MASH, Klinger's Korean
so
wife.
MASH,
yeah.
Like there's almost nobody Asian who on MASH, right? And MASH is about the Vietnam War, but they couldn't call it that because it's too raw. So they said it was in Korea. But MASH was really about Vietnam. But I don't remember too many lines spoken by Asian people on MASH. Kung Fu. Kung Fu, like that should be an Asian guy, David Carradine.
Yeah.
Whoa, how does that happen?
Yeah.
Yul Brynner, he's the king of Siam, right? John Wayne is Genghis Khan. And then there's that terrible Mickey Rooney character in Breakfast at Tiffany's. I don't know, do you remember? With the Japanese doorman or something, and he had the buck teeth and all. I mean, it's like the worst case of yellow face ever.
My generation was Long Duck Dong and 16 Candles. Right. Yeah. That was the 1980s.
Is he a porn star?
What's that?
He's not a porn star.
Maybe in some other universe. Right?
Sorry.
It's good that your doctor has a sense of humor. Right?
But I think there were more Oscars given for white people playing Asian characters than actually Asian people playing Asian characters, like Linda Hunt, Year of Living Dangerously, and Bruce Lee was an Asian guy playing an Asian guy, but he wanted to do kung fu, and they said no. So, and then there was the Good Earth had a German actress, Louise Rainier, right? And then there was, and then Yul Brynner, of course, won an Oscar as well. So, anyway, I'm getting off topic here. I'm digressing, I'm venting and ranting.
Well, now would be a good opportunity for me to read that scene from the Sympathizer that actually talks exactly about what you're talking about.
You talk to the auteur.
The auteur, yes.
Yes.
Okay, so, you know, one thing that happens to my narrator when he comes to the United States as a refugee is that he has to make a living. And one of the jobs that he gets is to become the authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. Right? But if Francis Ford Coppola were to ask, is not Apocalypse Now? And
especially if his lawyer asked.
Yeah, exactly. You know, but the point, I mean, it's actually the film is actually a compendium of all the American movies about the Vietnam War, which I watched when I was growing up in the 1980s. And it is not an exercise I recommend to anybody, okay? Yeah. But there's no doubt that the research for this section came out of Apocalypse Now. I read all the books on Apocalypse Now, and there's stuff you can't even make up. So the narrator gets a job, and in this scene, he meets with the auteur for the first time after having read his screenplay for his epic. It's going to be called The Hamlet. Not Hamlet, but The Hamlet, okay? All right. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say? Instead of having your screenplay direct as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language. Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there's some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean, Ching Chong English? Just to pretend that they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question. What was it? Oh, yes. How many movies have you made? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas. So I have to say that since
I'm
the
glad
book
I'm
came
not
out,
your kid, by the
right,
way.
Really? Okay. Yeah. Well, I have to say, since this book came out, I met with quite a few Hollywood people, and none of them dispute this characterization. Okay. I confess to being angry with the auteur, but was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know, and here's the context. The movie is about American Green Berets who go to the Central Highlands to train the local ethnic minorities to defend themselves against communism. This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Tay. Let me tell you a secret, the auteur said. You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priest understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or antihero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb.
That's so proud, but it's not saying that film isn't powerful, right? Because actually in The Sympathizer, possibly one of the most moving scenes, or one of the more moving scenes, is when the narrator visits the fake cemetery. So there's this cemetery that they built as part of the set, right? So it's clearly fake. And he is thinking about his mother's grave, right? And that's actually, must have been, I mean, I think from reading that was a very emotional part. And I saw it as, this is part of the saddest part, and it's at this fake cemetery on this set, and it maybe speaks of the power of art, of film, of writing.
Absolutely. No, film's absolutely powerful, and you're absolutely right that he visits this fake cemetery, thinks about his real dead mother, and in the fake cemetery is moved to enormous feeling for her loss. And that's what a great movie or a great book can do for us, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, going back to this idea of remembering and forgetting, oftentimes great works of art can move us deeply by helping us remember certain things and also making us forget certain things. So when we watch a great war movie, for example, for those of us who like war movies, and I like war movies, you're compelled to great feeling for the soldiers that you see on the screen, right? But in order for that to happen, you have to forget that the enemies that the soldier is fighting are human too. And you also have to forget that war is not just about soldiers. War is about civilians. But that's a nasty little fact that we have to forget in order to be moved by a war movie, right? We have to remember, one thing, if we remember, that more civilians died during the Vietnam War than soldiers did, it would ruin our fun. If we remembered that more civilians have died in 20th century wars than soldiers have done, we wouldn't be able to make war movies in the way that we do in Hollywood, right? So movies are enormously powerful, but they do it just like every other story, through a little bit of manipulation and subterfuge, and we have to be aware of that artifice, especially us who are writers and artists who are making these stories.
And the politics of representation, who make sure that people have voices. And so, speaking of voices, there's not a lot of roles there for Vietnamese people, but you're writing this book that's Sympathizer. It's like a big spy thing, and obviously I would be like someone you might cast in a leading role, possibly, because it's something I've always wanted to do since watching The Killing Fields, and there was a doctor there who won the Oscar. So, but then you kind of changed it. You made the main character biracial. so you took it away from me and you gave it to Keanu Reeves, right? As this is like a sellout kind of thing. I mean, there's no Vietnamese speaking parts again.
Well, I think you hit it exactly on target, you know, which is, okay, so I wrote a book called The Refugees before I wrote The Sympathizer, even though The Refugees came out second. And The Refugees are short stories mostly about Vietnamese people. So I felt like I already paid my respects to the Vietnamese community. There's plenty of roles for you.
There's a quota.
There's plenty of roles for you, okay?
But they're little short stories, little vignettes.
We're going to try to make it into a TV series, so you still have your chance. But you know what, after that, I thought, okay, well, it is important, getting back to the question of representation, right? It is important to tell stories about underrepresented people for all the obvious kinds of reasons. But there's a problem. Not all underrepresented people are nice people. This is a fact of life, okay? You know, human beings are mixed peoples. You know, they can be good, they can be bad, or whatever. Just because you're a minority or underrepresented doesn't mean you're an angel. And so what was very clear to me growing up in the Vietnamese community is that, you know, Vietnamese people are racist, okay? They're racist towards a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that's not something we generally talk about outside of the Vietnamese community. You don't bring up the bad stuff. And so I wanted to make sure in this novel, The Sympathizer, that I didn't give Vietnamese readers the easy way out, which is to say, oh, it's about a Vietnamese person, we can totally identify with this. And so I had to make a mixed race so that I could introduce the history of French colonialism, because his father's French, and so that I could talk about mixed race people, because there's a lot of them in Vietnam, and they're treated really badly by non-mixed race people. And I wanted to make Vietnamese readers question, well, why did he put a mixed race character in there? It's so that we can think about, who do we identify with? Do we only identify with people who are just like us? Or can we confront the fact that we ourselves participate in some of this very messy history as well?
I think it works on a lot of different ways, you know, all joking aside, because, you know, it's a metaphor for the division of Vietnam, the French influence in Vietnam. And actually, on a personal level, I really identify with that person more. I said patient, oh God, I'm slipping into my, it's Wednesday, I'm usually at work. So I identified with him because I don't see myself as fully Vietnamese anymore, as you said, born in Vietnam but made in America. And so in a way, when I go back to Vietnam, I feel more like a biracial person. I don't know if that's your feeling as well. And so in a way, it was easier for me personally reading this book to identify with that character.
When I was growing up in this Vietnamese community, I mean, I felt like when I was in my parents' household, which is a very Vietnamese household, I felt as if I was an American spying on them.
Yeah.
So I was at a step, you know, with strange food, strange customs, strange language. And then when I went out into the rest of the American world, I felt like I was a Vietnamese spying on Americans. So that wasn't quite being mixed race, but it was definitely of mixed culture. In that sense of always being a spy, you know, that's what I took.
There's the duality, schizophrenia there. We had to act differently at home than we did outside.
And then when I go to Vietnam, you know, the Vietnamese treat me sort of like as an oddity, because when they want my money, I'm an American. But when they want my love, I'm Vietnamese. So not exactly mixed race, but still you have that sense of being on the threshold. And having a mixed race narrator really exacerbates that and makes that more evident.
But I think I might push back a little bit on I agree that Vietnamese people actually are very racist. I mean, we say terrible things, but in a language nobody can understand.
So when you go to the Vietnamese nail salon and they're all talking, you know,
that's right.
Yes, they are talking about you.
It's not the hangnail that they're. But I think that the issue with Americans, actually Vietnamese people are more than race conscious, we're class conscious. And a lot of these people were born of out of wedlock, a serviceman, and a woman from very poor circumstances who then became a prostitute. So it's very low on a class system where you know, on a Mandarin system, that's pretty, so it's not just the Amerasian thing, it's also what the class of the parents represents, don't you think, that in Vietnam?
Yeah, and the plight of Eurasians and Amerasians in Vietnam after like over a century of French occupation and then American occupation or intervention, whatever you want to call it, is that he produced a lot of mixed race children. And the Amerasians were really treated very poorly, you know. But then what happened? They were all abandoned. And then in 1980, the United States Congress passed the Amerasian Homecoming Act, which said that Amerasians left in Vietnam could now come to the United States. So all those families who had kicked out the Amerasians in Vietnam suddenly wanted them back because that was your ticket to the United States at that point. And then they took them, they went to the United States, and many of them got abandoned by these very same families. And even though it was also about class, it continued to be about race. Because Amerasians who had white fathers were treated better than Amerasians with black fathers, for example. And so those continuing problems of race are there in Vietnam and here in the Vietnamese American community too.
Switch topics just a little bit. So the Sympathizer, he's a torturer, murderer.
You're giving away so much. He's also a nice, fun, happy, got good sense of humor.
So exactly. So is this autobiographical?
Absolutely.
Because it's written in the first person, right? So when you write in the first person, how much of that becomes you? So I went through your book, The Refugees, collection 8 short stories, and I counted. Okay, and there were 3 and 5, first person, third person. What's the experience like as a writer? I know as a reader how different it feels. As a writer, how does it feel to make that decision that I'm going to write this in the first person or the third person?
Well, one thing about The Refugees, I rarely write autobiographically. I wrote one autobiographical short story in The Refugees called War Years, and it is the one story that the Vietnamese government won't allow to be published in Vietnam. So they censored that one story out of the Vietnamese translation. So I thought, I didn't know my life was so dangerous. I thought it was so boring, But when it came time to write the Sympathizer, I knew I was not going to write an autobiographical novel or story. Because oftentimes that's what's expected of minority writers in this country. You only have one story to tell, your story, that's what's important. You don't write novels, you write memoirs or autobiographical novels. And it's like, well, I'm going to create a character who's so far out there, nobody in their right minds would mistake him for me, which is the best spy cover story of all. But he is autobiographical. Now, this is important in the sense that I just talked about, that I felt like a spy when I was growing up. And so I just had to create a character who could provide me the dramatic justification for saying everything I ever wanted to say, but which if I were just to tell you would be completely boring. No one wants to hear the professor talking, giving lectures and everything like that. But to create a character who could reasonably say all kinds of critical, smart-ass, cynical kinds of things, that was a lot of fun.
You're letting your voice go.
Yeah.
And this one, it's unusually dominating, right? Because it's not just told from the first person's point of view. It's actually the whole thing is his narration. He's narrating a confession. So everything is from his point of view.
And I had a lot of fun. This is actually very important to say.
It comes across.
Writing The Refugees, I started writing short stories first. And so I started writing short stories first as a writer because I thought, short stories are short. That means they must be easy. Well, after I put the first words down, it took me 17 years to finish that short story collection and another 3 years to publish it. So if I knew from the beginning it would take me 20 years, I probably never would have become a writer. But something happened.
The Pulitzer must have made it easier to publish it.
No, actually, what happened was, after 11 years, I stopped writing the short story collection because my agent said, if you want to publish books in New York City, you've got to write a novel too. I said, fine. I got 2 years off. I'm going to write a novel. And something had happened. After 11 years of just figuratively beating my head against a wall, it was a really frustrating experience writing these short stories, I broke through. And I sat down and the novel just poured out because somehow I had learned something through that wax-on, wax-off process of drafting the short stories that meant that I was ready to write a novel, and the novel was the right form for everything that I had to say, and so I could do it in 2 years, and it was relatively easy.
But he does some pretty bad stuff, huh? I mean, so was that kind of like a vicarious thrill for you? This is all the stuff I always wanted to do, and...
Yeah, murder people and torture people and things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you've had these fantasies.
I got a list.
Yeah. So right, being a writer is part.
Don't worry.
Being a writer is part about giving into your imagination. But also, what had happened was I'm a fan of spy novels. I'm a fan of war novels, and terrible things happen in these things, right? But also, what had happened was during the 2 years I was writing the novel, what I did that I had not done for a decade was watch TV. So I had not watched TV for a decade. I was too busy. And then I had 2 years off, so I would write in the morning, and then in the evening, I would watch cable TV shows.
So these are other influences besides Dostoevsky.
Oh, this is very important. Like I watched The Sopranos, The Wire, The Shield, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, and I learned a lot about plotting from watching serial TV dramas. And I actually learned a lot about plotting from reading a screenplay writing manual and writing a very bad screenplay. So I have no snobbishness about borrowing from popular culture, and I think more writers should, and a lot of writers actually do, steal from whatever we can find in terms of formulas and ideas and genres. And TV, you can get away with all kinds of stuff. People people spent how many seasons watching The Sopranos about a hitman and a murderer? And I was like, okay, if that's an acceptable character, then I can do that too. Mine doesn't have to be the suffering immigrant shopkeeper.
Well, it's
I can
amazing
make him a spy.
what you can get away with, though. I mean, because there are some limits there. And I think that your character does torture and assassinates, but does not commit rape. Now, when you talk about war, rape and pillage, right? I mean, rape seems like it's somehow woven into the fabric of war. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and you know, and unfortunately, this is the note that we're going to end on. But when I was a kid, I read a novel called Close Quarters by Larry Heineman, which won the National Book Award in the late '80s, I believe. And it's a novel about a young American, perfectly normal guy, goes to Vietnam, and within 10 pages becomes a killer. Okay, and the climax of the novel is not the gigantic battle that will take place. The climax of the novel is actually when he and his fellow nice Marines and everything gang rape a Vietnamese woman, prostitute. And I was 12 or 13. I read books, I read books that I should not have been reading at 12 or 13 years old. And I was so upset. I was so scarred by this experience. And I carried it with me for years, and I hated Larry Heineman, and I hated his novel, because I thought it was doing all these terrible things to Vietnamese people and to Vietnamese women. And then when I wrote The Sympathizer, I went back and reread a bunch of things that had shaped me in some ways, including Heineman's novel. And you know what? I felt now, as an adult and as a writer, Heineman was right. What I was looking for as a kid was someone to tell me, this is wrong.
Yeah.
People should not do this, you know. But what Heineman understood was that this actually happens in war. Doesn't matter if you're Vietnamese or Americans or whatever, it happens.
Right.
And as a writer, you have to confront that. And that's in The Sympathizer as well. But there's no doubt that war and rape are absolutely fundamentally tied together and always have been.
Just to fit, the greatest probably Vietnamese novel about war, The Sorrow of War by...
Which I was deeply influenced by.
He has a rape which occurs, North Vietnamese soldiers raping a North Vietnamese woman, too. I mean, it is, unfortunately.
Yeah. People ask me, you know, what book should I read about the Vietnam War that's from a Vietnamese point of view? Read Bao Ninh's The Sorrow of War. It's English. It's in English. I'm sure it's in this library. Very powerful novel.
Yeah. So I've done it again. I've run
actually
over time.
Yeah.
I haven't read your book, and I'd like it. It sounds like a great book, and I would get it. We call it the Vietnam War. We have a memorial. Go over to Vietnam. They'll call it the American War.
Yeah.
And they have a museum showing all the torture that we would be here and all the havoc. So I wonder how your parents felt, and if they portrayed that to you when they came over.
I think we have to wrap up. Right?
We may have to wrap up, but he'll be happy to step aside here and chat with you.
I'm not going anywhere, so I'll be happy to answer your questions on the side. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.